Good day, everyone. I am Regina Joy Din from Living Saints Homeschooling and Tutorial Center, Central Escolar University, Manila, Philippines. I am here to share my study on using translation text tests in identifying errors in written English of grade 11 students. Translation has always been known as a method of teaching language, but seldom as a testing tool. This paper tried to establish the use of translation as a test by identifying the errors of students in a written translation text test from Filipino to English. Three language features were covered in the translation text test: syntactic, lexical, and stylistic. The ultimate goal of the study was to provide an alternative method of testing language that would challenge students' creative thinking while expressing their ideas using correct grammar. Translation as a testing tool would also be an interesting addition to the variety of testing methods used by language teachers today. The setting of the study was in St. Andrew's School in Parañaque City. The respondents were grade 11 students enrolled in the school for school year 2017-2018. The findings of the study show that translation text test was found useful in identifying errors of students in written English, because it was able to show the extent and common types of errors that students commit in writing. Because translations tests are essay type, they are not easy to check, but a good translation text may be ideal as a summative test where students' discourse ability and general proficiency may be tested. Introduction. In learning a language, specifically the English language, it is essential to master the four macro skills: reading, writing, listening, and speaking to fully communicate one's ideas and thoughts using the language. It is undeniably important in engaging oneself in meaningful conversations, for this gives a person great opportunity to practice his or her mastery of the macro skills. In this study using translation texts in identifying errors in written English of the grade 11 students, another possible useful function of translation was studied. It was examined not as a method of teaching, but as a testing tool. Specifically, this study tried to show how translation tests can be used as a tool in measuring students' written proficiency through identification of their errors. Background of the study. The English language in the Philippines serves as a second language, where it is taught as a subject from grades 1 to 12. The English subject aims to enhance learners' language competencies such as reading, writing, listening, and speaking. In this study, the researcher hopes to explore another useful function of translation other than a teaching method, but also as a testing tool of students' language proficiency in written English through identification of their errors. Showing translation as a practical testing tool will not only provide teachers alternative methods of testing their students' written proficiency in English, but may even strengthen more its importance as a teaching method. Theoretical or conceptual framework. The theoretical framework of this study is grounded on the Discourse and Communication Translation Model Volkova 2012. According to Volkova, in using a translation strategy, there is a Type 1 model which is descriptive and explanatory with features such as translation-relevant communicative discourse parameters. Here is the figure 1 for Volkova's discourse and communication model, with translation microstrategies and translation macrostrategies, and text discourse with communication. For Table 1, we have textual level of the discourse and communication level. In syntactic, we have subject-verb agreement, verb tense, pronoun antecedent agreement. For lexical, we have vocabulary and spelling. Stylistic, we have the use of punctuations. This study focused primarily on the textual level of translation as it tried to determine the grammatical competence of the students through their language errors. Figure 1 shows the entire discourse and communication model of Volkova. Table 1 highlights the textual part of the model and the features which this study investigated in its error analysis using translation. Other features in the textual level such as semantics, pragmatics, and discursive were not used in this study. Only syntactic, lexical, and stylistics were used. statement of the problem. The study sought to show how translation text can be a useful tool in identifying students' errors in written English. Specifically, it aimed to answer the following questions. Number 1. What was the extent of errors of the students in the translation test with regard to each of the following textual categories? 1.1 Syntactic, 1.2 Lexical, 1.3 Stylistic. Number 2. What were the most common types of errors of the students in the translation test as revealed by the extent of their occurrence in the test? Number 3. What are the implications of the study with regard to translation as a testing tool based on the findings? Assumption of the study. The study was based on the assumption that the extent and types of errors of the students in their translation texts are indicators of their weaknesses in the English language. Review of related literature. Summary. Translation as a teaching method and a testing tool is currently gaining a lot of attention from many educators, students, and researchers of various countries. The recent studies evidently showed its effectiveness as a teaching tool inside the classroom. Akel 2013. However, aside from its advantages, translation has also received criticisms questioning its benefits to the school, educators, and students, where translation lacks use of engaging strategies and activities for the students, like at 2012. Compared to different teaching methods, authors and linguists believe that translation is one of the good teaching methods recommended in teaching the English language. Dagliana 2012. Based on the studies gathered, translation also enhances the comprehension, vocabulary, and grammar usage of the students studying the English and other foreign languages. Ito 2017. Using translation as a testing method checks the student's ability to comprehend the given text and translate it to its target language. Rahimi, Jufri, and RD 2013. Through research, translation has been shown useful as a teaching method and a testing tool. This study attempted to confirm the latter claim. Methods and procedure. Methods of research use. This research used a descriptive, non-experimental method using translation tests to measure students' linguistic competence through their language errors in written English. It utilized quantitative approach in identifying the students' extent of errors and qualitative method in illustrating and describing the types of errors committed by the students in the translation test. Statistical treatment of data. The data gathered from the tests that were established by the findings of the study were recorded, analyzed, and interpreted using the following formulas. Frequency and percentage for students' test errors and ratings, mean for averages of scores. The data gathered were submitted to an external statistician approved by the CEU Graduate School. Discussions. First, extent of errors in the translation test with regard to each of the following textual categories: syntactic, lexical, and stylistic. Table 2. Extent of errors in the translation test with regard to each of the following textual categories: syntactic, lexical, and stylistic. For grammar, we have moderate extent. For word usage, we have moderate extent. Spelling, we have least extent. And last one, we have punctuation, least extent. Grammar errors were moderate extent. Errors in its three subcategories, namely subject-verb agreement, verb tense, and pronouns, were moderate extent, least extent, and also least extent. Respectively, errors in word usage was moderate extent, while in spelling it was least extent. Punctuation errors were also least extent. Most common types of errors of the students in translation tests as revealed by their extent of occurrence in the test. These findings seem to show that in translation texts, the students' weakness in the four categories significantly differed. They manifested greatest difficulty in grammar, followed by word usage. The least difficult in the translation texts was noted in spelling and punctuation. Grammar as the most difficult language category for students to study is supported by Abbasi and Shabani study 2011, which states that the language difficulty of most students lies in grammar. Also, the researcher observed that some of the errors were due to the influence of the student's native tongue, where the equivalence in the languages depend on its context. Third, we have implications of the study with regard to translation as a testing tool based on the findings. 3.1 The translation text has revealed that students find grammar the most difficult language skill to master, followed by vocabulary or word usage. 3.2 The results of this study on translation texts as a testing tool show that it is a good alternative to tool in identifying the students' errors in written English. Summary of findings. This study sought to show how translation texts can be an effective method of identifying the extent and common types of errors students make in writing using the English language. This goal was addressed in the study by investigating the following. First, extent of errors of students in the written translation test. Students showed moderate extent of errors in grammar and word usage, but least extent in spelling and punctuations. Second, common types of errors made by students in the translation test. The most common types of errors students made in the translation test were in grammar, specifically verb-subject agreement, verb tenses, and pronoun antecedent agreement. The next type was shown to be word usage, especially correct word choice in sentences. Spelling and punctuation errors were not very common. Third, implications of the findings of the study on the use of translation texts in identifying errors in writing. Translation text was found useful in identifying errors of students in written English because it was able to show the extent and common types of errors that students commit in writing. Because translations tests are essay type, they are not easy to check, but a good translation text may be ideal as a summative test where students' discourse ability is being tested. Conclusion. Based on the findings of the study, the following conclusion is drawn. Translation text test is a useful tool in identifying students' errors in written English. It can yield valuable information regarding the most common types of errors that students make and the extent of occurrence of these errors in their written compositions. Recommendations. From the conclusion drawn, the researcher recommends the following. Number 1. Teachers of English. 1.1 To use translation text as an alternative mode of testing, especially as a summative test at the end of the term to gauge students' discourse ability and overall proficiency in the English language. 1.2 To devise good translation texts for testing in coordination with Filipino foreign language teachers. Number 2. Other researchers. Since there are few studies that discuss and review translation text tests as a testing tool, it is needed for researchers to undertake a similar study in order to validate findings of this study or to embark on a study using different languages. References. This is the end of my presentation and thank you very much for listening.